It was a quiet, moonless night when Jake, a seasoned pizza delivery driver, loaded up his last order for the evening. The address was unfamiliar, a remote house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. The place wasn't on his usual route, but he didn't think much of it. Orders came from all sorts of places, and tips were often better from the people who lived out in the sticks. Jake's GPS struggled as he drove, the route flickering and recalculating every few minutes. After a few wrong turns and some frustration, he spotted the mailbox with the address scrawled faintly in peeling white paint. The house itself was set far back from the road, barely visible except for a faint glow from one of the windows. As he pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching beneath his tires, he noticed the overgrown weeds and rusting swing set in the yard. The place looked abandoned. Jake hesitated but grabbed the pizza bag and stepped out of the car. The air was unnervingly still. No sound of crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Approaching the front door, Jake knocked firmly. The sound echoed through the house, but no one answered. After waiting a moment, he knocked again, this time a bit louder. Still nothing. He shifted nervously, debating whether to leave the pizza on the porch and drive off. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. A faint creak startled him as the door opened slightly. He peered inside, his heart pounding. The dim interior was cluttered with old furniture, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Just as he was about to step back and leave, a raspy voice called out from deeper within the house. "Come in. Leave it on the table." Jake froze. He hadn't seen anyone inside, but the voice sounded deliberate, calm. Against his better judgment, he stepped into the foyer. The door creaked as it swung open, wider behind him, seemingly of its own accord. A small wooden table stood a few feet away, covered in dust. Jake set the pizza down quickly, eager to leave. "Thank you," the voice rasped again, closer this time. Jake turned sharply, scanning the shadows. "You're welcome. Enjoy your pizza." He backed toward the door, his instincts screaming at him to get out. Just as he reached for the doorknob, he noticed something odd. The pizza bag he had placed on the table was gone. In its place was a single photograph. His stomach dropped as he picked it up. It was a picture of him, taken just moments ago, standing on the porch, knocking on the door. Jake's breath hitched. He spun around, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The air grew colder and the oppressive silence deepened. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. His first instinct was to bolt, but the door wouldn't budge when he yanked on it. It felt as though it had been sealed shut. The footsteps grew louder, descending the staircase at an agonizingly slow pace. Jake turned and saw a figure emerge, a tall man in tattered clothing, his face obscured by shadow. "Get out of my house," the man growled, though there was an unsettling calm to his tone. "I'm trying," Jake stammered, yanking on the door with all his strength. It wouldn't give. The man stepped closer, his movements unnatural, almost jerky. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, and his voice seemed to echo unnaturally, coming from every corner of the house. Jake turned and ran deeper into the house, desperate to find another exit. The walls seemed to close in around him as he sprinted through narrow hallways that didn't make sense, the layout of the house twisting and contorting. He found himself in a kitchen, then a bedroom, then back in the foyer where he had started. The table was empty now. No photograph, no pizza, just a faint smear of something dark and sticky. A loud bang came from behind him, and Jake turned to see the front door wide open. Without thinking, he ran toward it, his legs pumping furiously. Just as he reached the threshold, something icy grabbed his arm. He screamed, jerking free and tumbling onto the porch. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted to his car, like fumbling with the keys before finally getting the door unlocked. As he sped away, Jake glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was completely dark, no sign of life. But as he turned his attention back to the road, his stomach dropped. Sitting in the passenger seat was the same man, his shadowy face turned toward Jake. "You forgot your tip," the man whispered. Jake's car swerved violently off the road, crashing into a tree. When the police arrived hours later, they found the vehicle abandoned. The driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open. Inside the car, the only thing out of place was a single cold pizza and an old photograph of Jake, standing on the porch of the house.
Story number 2.
Ethan had worked as a pizza delivery driver for 2 years, and he prided himself on his ability to handle strange situations. He'd been chased by dogs, scammed by fake customers, and even driven through a thunderstorm to deliver an extra-large pepperoni. But nothing had prepared him for what happened that night. It started with a routine order. a large meat lover's pizza, and a bottle of soda. The address was in a neighborhood Ethan didn't recognize, but the GPS led him to a decrepit house at the edge of town. As he pulled up, he noticed the house was barely standing, with cracked windows and a sagging roof. He double-checked the address, thinking there must be a mistake. The porch light flickered weakly, illuminating a front yard littered with rusted tools and broken furniture. Ethan hesitated, debating whether to call the customer and confirm the order. Before he could reach for his phone, the front door creaked open, revealing a figure standing in the shadows. The figure didn't step outside, but a raspy voice called out, "Come to the back door, use the side gate." Ethan froze. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but he thought about his paycheck and the potential tip. He reluctantly walked around the side of the house, pushing open the creaky gate. The backyard was worse than the front, overrun with weeds and random junk. A faint glow spilled out from a window, casting eerie shadows across the yard. When he reached the back door, it was already open. The dim light inside revealed a narrow hallway leading into darkness. Ethan called out, "Hello? I've got your pizza." No response. "Hello?" he repeated, louder this time. Something moved in the shadows, a faint shuffling sound, like feet dragging across the floor. Ethan stepped closer to the threshold, squinting into the darkness. He could barely make out a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, motionless. "You can leave it on the counter," the raspy voice said again. It sounded closer now, but the figure hadn't moved. Ethan stepped inside cautiously, clutching the pizza box like a shield. He spotted a small kitchen to his left and placed the pizza on the counter. The air was thick with an unpleasant metallic smell, and the walls were stained with something dark. He wanted to leave immediately, but his curiosity got the better of him. He turned to glance down the hallway, but the figure was gone. Your pizza's here," Ethan said, backing toward the door. He heard the faint shuffle of footsteps again, this time coming from above him. He looked up and saw a hatch leading to the attic. It was slightly ajar, and something was moving behind it. Ethan bolted for the back door, but just as he reached it, he heard a loud thud from the attic. He stopped. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned around, his eyes fixed on the hatch. It swung open with a groan, revealing a dark void. Something dropped from the attic. Something large. It landed with a wet splat on the floor, but Ethan didn't stay to find out what it was. He ran out the door, slamming it behind him. As he sprinted across the yard, he glanced back and saw the figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and gaunt, with unnaturally long limbs and a head that tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Ethan jumped into his car and started the engine, his hands shaking violently. He sped away, glancing in the rearview mirror. The figure was still standing in the doorway, watching him. When Ethan got back to the pizzeria, he told his manager about the incident. The manager frowned and pulled out a thick binder of addresses. After flipping through it for a moment, he looked up at Ethan with a pale face. "There's no way you delivered to that house," the manager said. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "That house burned down 5 years ago," the manager replied. "A family died in the fire. No one lives there anymore." Ethan didn't believe him at first. But the next day, he drove back to the address to prove it. What he found chilled him to the core. The house was nothing but a charred, crumbling ruin, covered in ash and overgrown weeds. Sitting in the middle of the wreckage was an untouched pizza box, with Ethan's handwriting on the receipt. And inside the box, instead of pizza, was a photo of Ethan, standing in the kitchen of the ruined house, looking up at the attic hatch.
Story number 3.
It was a stormy Friday night, and Sean was trying to finish his last delivery before heading home. The rain poured in sheets, making it hard to see through his windshield. The address was miles outside of town, deep in the woods. He was tempted to reject the delivery, but it was already assigned to him, and the pizzeria's policy was clear: no skipped orders. As he drove, the paved roads turned to dirt, and his car jostled over potholes and uneven terrain. Lightning illuminated the dense forest around him, revealing twisted branches and gnarled trees that seemed to reach for his car. The GPS signal flickered but held steady, guiding him to a narrow, overgrown driveway that led to an old 2-story house. The house looked ancient, with peeling paint, sagging shutters, and a roof that seemed on the verge of collapse. Sean checked the order details again. 1 medium veggie pizza, cash payment. He grabbed the pizza and trudged through the rain toward the front door. He knocked, but the sound barely carried over the storm. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a young girl, no older than 10, standing in the dim light of the doorway. She had pale skin, long dark hair, and wore a tattered dress that looked like it belonged in another century. "Hi there," Sean said, forcing a smile. "I've got your pizza." The girl didn't respond. She just stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes. After an uncomfortable silence, she finally spoke in a whisper. "Come in. He's waiting." Sean hesitated. I'm not supposed to come inside. Could you—" "Come in," she repeated, her voice firm despite its softness. Against his better judgment, Sean stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. The air was heavy, and the dim lighting cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. The girl closed the door behind him and pointed toward a room down the hall. "He's in there," she said, her voice barely audible. Sean swallowed hard. "Who's waiting?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked up the creaking staircase, disappearing into the darkness. Sean stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. The storm raged outside, and his car was parked a good distance away. Leaving without payment would mean trouble with his boss, but something about the house felt wrong. Deeply, unshakably wrong. "Hello?" Sean called out, his voice echoing faintly. No response. He slowly made his way down the hall, gripping the pizza box tightly. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, and a faint orange light flickered from within, like the glow of a fire. As he pushed the door open, he was hit with a wave of heat. Inside the room was a fireplace, roaring with flames despite the humid summer night. The walls were covered in old, faded photographs, all of them showing the same family, a man, a woman, and the little girl who had answered the door. In the center of the room stood a man. He was tall, with a gaunt face and hollow eyes that seemed to glint unnaturally in the firelight. He was wearing a suit, but it was old and tattered, like something you'd see in a black and white photograph. "You made it," the man said, his voice deep and resonant. Yeah," Sean stammered. "Your pizza." The man didn't move or blink. He just stared at Sean, an unsettling smile spreading across his face. "Leave it on the table," the man said, gesturing to a small table near the fireplace. Sean placed the box down and turned to leave, but the man's voice stopped him. "Stay a moment," the man said. "I really have to get going," Sean replied, his voice trembling. The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. "You've already stayed longer than most," he said. Sean's heart raced. He turned and bolted for the door, sprinting down the hallway and out of the house. The rain soaked him as he ran to his car, but he didn't care. He just wanted to get as far away as possible. As he fumbled with his keys, he heard the faint sound of footsteps on the gravel behind him. He turned, expecting to see the man or the girl, but there was no one there. He jumped into the car, started the engine, and sped down the driveway, his tires skidding on the wet dirt. When he reached the main road, he glanced in the rearview mirror, and his blood ran cold. The girl was sitting in the back seat, her wide eyes staring directly at him. Sean slammed on the brakes and turned around, but the back seat was empty. His heart pounded as he looked around frantically. The storm seemed to grow louder, the thunder crashing like it was right above him. When he finally reached the pizzeria, Sean burst through the doors, drenched and shaking. His coworkers stared at him, alarmed. "What happened?" one of them asked. Sean tried to explain, but as he reached into his pocket for the receipt, his hand brushed against something cold. He pulled it out and stared in horror. It was one of the old photographs from the house, the man, the woman, and the little girl. But now, there was a fourth figure in the picture. It was Sean, standing in the hallway holding the pizza box.
Story number 4.
It was nearing midnight, and Lucas, a college student working part-time as a pizza delivery driver, was itching to finish his last run of the night. The address was a place he hadn't heard of before, Edgewood Road. When he punched it into his GPS, the directions pointed him toward a remote area on the outskirts of town, surrounded by nothing but old farmland. The drive was uneventful at first, but as he got closer, the streetlights disappeared, and the road narrowed into a single, cracked lane flanked by tall, swaying cornstalks. The GPS chimed that he was close, but when Lucas looked around, he didn't see any houses, just endless rows of corn stretching into the darkness. He slowed the car to a crawl, squinting to make out the address on the mailbox that suddenly loomed out of the dark. Faded numbers barely clung to the rusted metal, but they matched the delivery slip. Lucas glanced at the house, or rather, what was left of it. It was a dilapidated, two-story farmhouse that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The roof was partially caved in, and the windows were either shattered or missing entirely. Lucas checked the address again, confused. Why would anyone order pizza to a place like this? He considered driving back to the restaurant, but he needed the tip. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed the pizza and climbed out of the car. The night air was eerily still, and the distant rustling of the cornfields sounded almost like whispers. As he approached the front door, the boards beneath his feet creaked loudly, shattering the silence. Lucas knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time. "Pizza delivery," he called out. A faint sound came from inside the house. It was soft at first, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. Lucas took a step back, clutching the pizza box tightly. The door creaked open an inch, revealing total darkness inside. "Hello?" Lucas said, leaning slightly closer. "Your pizza's here." A voice drifted out of the shadows, quiet and raspy. "Come in." Lucas hesitated. I'm not supposed to go inside. Can you—" "Come in," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. Something about the tone sent a shiver down Lucas's spine. Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open a little wider and stepped inside. The interior was worse than he imagined. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, old newspapers, and what looked like claw marks gouged into the walls. A faint flicker of light came from deeper within the house. "Hello?" Lucas called again, his voice shaky. The door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, fumbling for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs, slow and deliberate, like someone descending one step at a time. Lucas froze, his pulse racing. I'll just leave the pizza here," he shouted, placing the box on a nearby table. The footsteps stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a different sound emerged, a wet, squelching noise, like something dragging itself across the floor. Lucas backed away from the table, his eyes darting toward the hallway that led to the stairs. The dim light grew brighter as a figure slowly emerged from the shadows. At first, it looked human, a man hunched over and gaunt, with skin that hung loosely off his bones. But as it stepped closer, Lucas realized something was horribly wrong. Its arms were unnaturally long, nearly dragging on the floor, and its face was missing. Instead of eyes, there were deep, empty sockets, and its mouth was stretched wide open, filled with rows of jagged, blackened teeth. Lucas stumbled backward, his foot catching on a broken chair. He fell hard, the air rushing out of his lungs. The creature moved closer, its elongated fingers scraping along the walls. "Stay back!" Lucas shouted, scrambling to his feet. The thing tilted its head, as if curious. Then, in a voice that mimicked the raspy tone from earlier, it said, "Pizza. Delivery." Lucas bolted, sprinting toward the back of the house. He didn't care where he ended up, as long as it was away from that thing. He burst into the kitchen, only to find a back door that was nailed shut. Desperation clawed at him as he searched for another way out. Behind him, the wet, dragging sound grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Lucas grabbed a rusted kitchen knife from the counter and turned to face the hallway. The creature was there, its grotesque form filling the doorway. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyeless gaze fixed on Lucas. He didn't wait for it to get closer. With a surge of adrenaline, he hurled the knife at the thing and dove through a nearby window. Glass shattered around him as he hit the ground outside, rain soaking his clothes. He didn't stop to look back. Lucas ran to his car, fumbling with the keys as he climbed inside. The engine sputtered but finally roared to life. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was dark and lifeless, like nothing had ever been there. When Lucas got back to the pizzeria, he tried to explain what happened, but no one believed him. They checked the address in the system, only to discover something chilling. The order had been placed from a number that hadn't been active in years. A few weeks later, Lucas quit his job. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched, especially late at night when the wind would howl through the trees and something would brush against his window. One morning, he found a pizza box sitting on his porch. Inside was a single photograph. Lucas standing in the hallway of the abandoned house, the eyeless creature looming behind him.
Story number 5.
Jake had been working as a pizza delivery driver for about a year, and he'd seen it all. Angry customers, bizarre late-night orders, and even a few people answering the door in nothing but underwear. But he had never experienced anything like the night he was called to deliver to Ridgewood Asylum. The order came through just before midnight. 2 large pizzas with a note that read, "Delivered to the south entrance, knock 3 times." Jake laughed it off as some kind of prank. After all, Ridgewood Asylum had been abandoned for decades. It was a local legend, a place rumored to be haunted by the patients who had died there under mysterious circumstances. Still, orders were orders. His manager insisted he take it. "If it's a prank, we'll charge them for wasting our time," the manager said with a shrug. Jake wasn't thrilled about driving to the creepy old asylum, but he needed the money. The roads leading up to Ridgewood were narrow and winding, surrounded by dense forest. The deeper he drove, the more uneasy he felt. His headlights barely pierced the darkness, and every shadow seemed to move just out of his line of sight. When he finally arrived, he was struck by how massive the asylum was. The building loomed against the night sky, its windows dark and empty. Vines had overtaken much of the facade, and the air smelled damp and metallic, like rust and decay. Jake parked near the south entrance just as the note instructed. The large wooden doors were slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. "Okay," Jake muttered to himself. "Knock 3 times, drop the pizzas, and leave." He grabbed the pizzas and stepped up to the entrance. The boards beneath his feet creaked loudly, echoing into the empty halls. He hesitated, staring into the void beyond the doorway. Then he knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. For a moment, nothing happened. Jake let out a nervous laugh, ready to leave the pizzas and bolt back to his car. But then, from somewhere deep inside the building, he heard it. A slow, deliberate knock in response. Knock! 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 Jake's stomach turned, but he tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the sound of the old building settling, or an animal. He called out, "Hello? Pizza delivery!" A faint voice echoed back. "Come in." Jake's heart raced. He considered leaving the pizzas on the steps, but his curiosity got the better of him. Against his better judgment, he stepped through the doorway. The air inside was freezing, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something worse, something sharp and metallic. The floor was littered with debris, and the walls were covered in graffiti, most of it warnings like, "Don't stay after dark." "They watch you. Leave now." Jake tried to ignore it. "Hello?" he called again, his voice shaking. A soft sound caught his attention. Laughter. It was faint, like a child giggling in another room. Jake gripped the pizza boxes tighter and moved further into the building, following the sound. The laughter grew louder as he approached a door at the end of the hallway. The faint glow of a candlelight flickered from underneath it. "I'm just going to drop these here," Jake said, his voice trembling. He placed the pizzas on the floor and turned to leave. But as he stepped away, the laughter stopped abruptly. Then from behind the door came the sound of someone whispering his name. "Jake?" He froze. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't told anyone his name. "Jake." The voice whispered again, more insistent. Suddenly the door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black room. Jake couldn't see anything beyond the threshold, but he felt something, an oppressive, cold presence that seemed to reach out for him. Panicking, he turned and ran back the way he came. His footsteps echoed loudly in the empty halls as he sprinted toward the entrance. But when he reached the doorway, it wasn't there. Instead of the open doors leading back outside, he found himself facing another hallway, identical to the one he had just run down. He spun around, desperate to retrace his steps, but the asylum seemed to shift around him. The walls stretched and warped, and every door led to another endless corridor. "Jake," the voice called again, louder now, coming from every direction. His head whipped around, his breathing ragged. Shadows moved along the edges of his vision, darting between doorways and corners. He stumbled into a room, slamming the door shut behind him. Inside, the air was suffocatingly cold. Jake turned to see the room was filled with broken furniture, old medical equipment, and a single chair in the center. Sitting in the chair was a figure. It was a man in a tattered hospital gown, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were wide and glassy, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. But the worst part was the deep, bloody gouges running down his arms, as if he'd clawed at himself over and over. The figure twitched, its head snapping upright, its lifeless eyes locked onto Jake. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped. Jake bolted out of the room, his screams echoing down the hallways. He ran blindly, the asylum shifting around him like a maze. No matter which way he turned, the shadows followed, closing in. Finally, he burst through a doorway and found himself outside. Rain pelted his face as he stumbled toward his car. Without looking back, he jumped inside, started the engine, and sped away. When Jake reached the pizzeria, he was shaking, his clothes soaked with sweat and rain. He tried to explain what had happened, but his coworkers dismissed it as a prank or a bad dream. Later that night, as Jake sat in his apartment, he heard a faint knock at his door. Knock, knock, knock. His blood ran cold. When he opened the door, there was nothing there but a pizza box. Inside, scrawled in blood-red letters, was a single word, welcome.
Story number 6.
Max hated late-night deliveries, especially in unfamiliar neighborhoods, but the order that came through at 11:45 p.m. was for a large deluxe pizza, cash payment with a delivery address just outside of town. It wasn't unusual. Plenty of people in rural areas ordered from the pizzeria. What struck Max as odd, though, was the note attached to the order. Do not honk. Do not knock. Leave the pizza by the well. Max showed it to his coworker, who shrugged. Probably some weird prepper. Just drop it off and get out of there. Reluctantly, Max agreed. The drive was long, the roads becoming darker and narrower the farther he went. The trees seemed to close in on him, their branches forming eerie silhouettes against the cloudy night sky. His headlights barely illuminated the road ahead. When he reached the location, the GPS announced, "You have arrived." Max slowed down, frowning. There was no house in sight, just an overgrown clearing with a single structure at its center, an old crumbling stone well. This can't be right, Max muttered, double-checking the address, but it matched perfectly. He grabbed the pizza box, stepping out of his car into the chilly night air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. He approached the well cautiously, the gravel crunching under his feet. The closer he got, the more uneasy he felt. The well looked ancient, its stones slick with moss. A wooden bucket hung from a frayed rope, swaying slightly in the breeze. Max set the pizza down by the base of the well, then straightened up, eager to leave. But as he turned back toward his car, he heard it. A faint, echoing whisper. Hungry. Max froze, his skin crawling. The whisper had come from the well. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Is someone down there?" For a moment, there was silence. Then the whisper came again, louder this time. "So hungry. Please." Against his better judgment, Max leaned over the edge of the well, peering into the darkness. He couldn't see anything, just an endless black void. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from deep within the well, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged. Max stumbled back, nearly dropping his phone. That was enough for him. He hurried back to his car, but when he reached it, he stopped dead in his tracks. The front driver's side door was wide open. Max knew he had locked it. Heart pounding, he approached cautiously, shining his phone's flashlight into the car. The interior was empty, but the pizza delivery bag had been torn open and the receipt was gone. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but just as he reached for the door handle, he heard it again. Hungry. The voice was right behind him. Max whipped around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then his light caught movement near the well. Something was crawling out. It moved unnaturally, its long, skeletal limbs clawing at the stones as it hoisted itself upward. Its face was obscured by stringy, wet hair, but Max could see its teeth, rows of jagged, yellowed fangs that glinted in the light. He didn't wait to see more. Max jumped into his car, slamming the door and locking it. He turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. Come on, he muttered, trying again. The creature was closer now, its limbs bending and snapping as it dragged itself toward him. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its mouth opened impossibly wide. Finally, the engine roared to life. Max floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up gravel as he sped away. He didn't stop until he reached the pizzeria, where he stumbled inside, pale and shaking. His co-workers laughed it off, thinking he was trying to scare them with some late-night story. But the next morning, when Max came in for his shift, the manager pulled him aside. "Hey," the manager said, holding up the order slip from the previous night. "That address you delivered to? Did you actually go there?" "Yeah," Max replied hesitantly. "Why?" The manager's expression darkened. We've gotten calls from that address before. Every driver who goes there quits the next day, and none of them will say why. Max stared at him, his stomach sinking. Do yourself a favor, the manager said, lowering his voice. Don't go back. Max didn't need convincing. He quit that afternoon. But that night, as he lay in bed, he heard something outside his window. It was a faint whisper, carried on the wind. Still hungry.
Story number 7.
Tom was a pizza delivery driver in a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone. Most nights were uneventful, boring, even. But on the night of the blackout, everything changed. The power had gone out across the town, leaving streets dark and silent. Despite this, orders kept coming in, and Tom was assigned a delivery to a house on Hollow Creek Road, an isolated area near the edge of the woods. He knew the area was sparsely populated, but he'd never heard of the house number before. He checked the slip again as he drove down the pitch-black road, his car the only source of light for miles. The GPS struggled to load directions, the spinning wheel on his phone screen glowing faintly in the dark. Tom cursed under his breath. When the GPS finally pinged, it guided him to a narrow dirt path leading off the main road. It was overgrown with weeds, barely wide enough for his car. Hesitating for a moment, he turned onto the path, his tires crunching over the loose gravel. After what felt like an eternity, the house came into view, or rather a shadow of a house. It was a ramshackle 2-story structure, its wooden siding gray and peeling, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out what little moonlight there was. Tom parked his car and grabbed the pizza box, stepping out into the chilly night air. The stillness was unnerving. No crickets, no wind, just the faint hum of his car engine and his own footsteps on the dirt. He approached the front door and knocked. The sound echoed far louder than it should have, as if the house were hollow. A full minute passed. No answer. Pizza delivery, Tom called out. The door creaked open just a few inches. From the darkness inside, a voice whispered, "Come in." Tom froze. He leaned slightly closer, but couldn't see anyone. I'm not supposed to go inside," he said nervously. "Come in," the voice repeated, louder this time, more urgent. Tom backed up, placing the pizza box on the porch. "I'll just leave it here," he said, turning to leave. But before he could take a step, the door swung open fully, slamming against the wall. The sudden noise made him jump, and he instinctively looked back. The interior of the house was pitch black. From somewhere deep inside, a different voice, low, guttural, and almost inhuman, growled, "You're already here." Tom didn't wait to hear more. He ran back to his car, heart pounding. As he fumbled with his keys, he heard footsteps, heavy, uneven, and fast, approaching from behind. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a figure emerging from the house. It was tall and gaunt, with impossibly long arms that scraped against the door frame as it stepped outside. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. Tom threw himself into the car, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the figure fully. It wasn't human. Its skin was gray and stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The thing broke into a sprint, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. It chased after the car. Tom floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning before they caught traction. The creature was fast, faster than anything he'd ever seen, and it was gaining on him. He swerved back onto the main road, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature's clawed hands slammed against the back of the car, leaving deep scratches in the metal. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw the lights of the town ahead. The creature stopped abruptly, standing in the middle of the road, watching as Tom sped away. When he reached the pizzeria, he stumbled inside, breathless and trembling. His coworkers laughed nervously as he tried to explain what had happened, but none of them believed him. The next day, when Tom went to return the delivery bag to his car, he found something that made his blood run cold. The scratched-up pizza box was sitting in the passenger seat, untouched. Written across the top in dark, smeared letters was a single word: soon.
Story number 8.
Liam had always heard strange rumors about the Hastings house at the edge of town. Supposedly, it had been abandoned for decades, but locals whispered that lights could sometimes be seen flickering in the windows late at night. It was the kind of place teenagers dared each other to approach on Halloween. Liam never thought much of it, until the night he was sent there with a delivery. It was a stormy evening, and the rain came down in sheets, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Liam didn't even realize where he was headed until the GPS declared, "Arrived at destination. and his headlights illuminated the massive, decaying mansion at the end of a gravel driveway. The house was towering, its shutters hanging loose, its windows dark and menacing. Liam double-checked the address. It was correct. Maybe someone's fixing it up, he muttered to himself. But he didn't believe it. He grabbed the pizza and ran through the rain to the front porch. The wooden steps groaned under his weight, and the air smelled damp and rotten. He knocked on the massive wooden door, the sound echoing eerily. No answer. "Pizza delivery," he called, knocking again. Still nothing. Just as he was about to give up and head back to his car, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit foyer. "Hello," Liam called, hesitating. He wasn't supposed to enter customers' homes, but the rain was pouring harder now, and he didn't want to leave the pizza outside. From somewhere deep inside the house came a voice. Soft, almost melodic. "Come in." Every instinct told him to leave, but something about the voice pulled him forward. He stepped inside, clutching the pizza box tightly. The interior of the house was even worse than the outside. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture covered in thick layers of dust. The air was stale, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. "Where do you want the pizza?" Liam called out, his voice shaky. The voice came again, this time closer. "Upstairs." Liam froze. "I can't go upstairs," he said firmly. "You'll need to come down and grab it." Silence. Then the voice whispered directly into his ear. "You're already upstairs." Liam's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, but the foyer was gone. The front door was gone. He was standing in a long, narrow hallway lined with closed doors. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he backed away, clutching the pizza like a shield. He tried the first door. Locked. He moved to the next, also locked. Behind him, one of the doors creaked open. Liam turned slowly, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. The door at the end of the hall was now ajar, a faint glow spilling out from within. "Please, just take the pizza," he shouted, his voice cracking. The glow grew brighter, and the faint sound of laughter drifted out. A child's laughter, high-pitched and hollow. Liam's hands shook as he placed the pizza on the floor and backed away. The laughter grew louder, joined by a second voice, and then a third, until it was a cacophony of giggles echoing through the hallway. The walls began to tremble, and the doors rattled in their frames. Liam turned and ran, sprinting down the endless corridor. No matter how far he ran, the hallway stretched on, the laughter growing louder and louder. Finally, he burst through a door and found himself back outside, standing in the pouring rain. He was in his car, though he couldn't remember getting inside. Liam started the engine and sped away, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. He didn't stop until he was back at the pizzeria, where he slammed the door shut behind him, gasping for air. His coworkers stared at him, alarmed. "Liam, you okay?" He tried to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, he just shook his head. "I'm done. I'm not going back out there." They let him go home early. The next day, Liam returned to the pizzeria to pick up his paycheck. As he walked toward his car in the parking lot, he noticed something odd. The pizza bag was sitting in the back seat, even though he hadn't put it there. Curious, he opened the bag and found the pizza box inside. It was untouched, the lid closed tight, but scrawled across the top in dripping black ink were 3 chilling words. "See you soon."